In this section of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the period of colonisation, the aftermath of colonisation, and then the period which, as we saw in the last section of the lecture, was a period of relatively strong economic growth in Latin America from the 1870s through to the period after World War I, before the Great Depression. First of all, I want to start out by talking about what is really a major theme in Latin American economic history, which really goes back to the colonisation phase and extends through to the present. And that's about the long-run effect of institutions and the origins of institutions in Latin America. So this is a quote from the Chilean economist Sebastian Edwards, where he argues that there's considerable agreement among scholars that institutional weakness has contributed significantly to Latin America's mediocre long-term performance. So the idea that institutions are an important determinant of economic development in Latin America. And of course, as we've seen earlier in the course, when we think about institutions and why regions or countries have institutions that they do, we often find that the origins of those institutions lie in the past. And similar arguments have been made about Latin America, which it's useful to take up at this time where we're talking about the experience of colonisation and the immediate aftermath. The history of institutions in Latin America is really the history of the creation of an elite. As we've seen, Latin America was colonised by the Spanish and Portuguese in the 15th and 16th century. We've seen as well in a previous lecture on this phase of globalisation that there were various major impacts on Latin America from, and other regions where the globalisation was occurring, from the European colonisation. For example, major reductions, loss of life in population from the spread of Western diseases. Here, I want to focus on the effect on institutions of the colonisation experience. The initial manifestation of the creation of an elite in Latin America is what's often referred to as the encomienda system. Under the encomienda system, conquistadors were essentially endowed with a group of the native population. They were given the responsibility for imbuing that population with the Roman Catholic, or training them in the Roman Catholic faith. And in return for undertaking that responsibility, they were given the right to use that group of native population as a labour supply, as a source of labour in undertaking economic activities that they wanted to in Latin America. Initially, the focus of economic activity, the first phase of colonisation, was on expropriation of mineral resources. So, for example, the Potosi silver mine, which was set up in 1544, is an example of an economic activity where the source of labour essentially was labour supplied from the native population, essentially being forced to work in the silver mine by the Spanish in that case. Subsequently, there was a second stage of colonisation, which involved the development of economic activity to include the supply of raw agricultural materials to Europe as part of the industrial growth in Europe in the Industrial Revolution. In that phase, the institutional implementation of the creation of elite really came through the creation of large land estates. So the allocation of large amounts of land to a narrow or small group in the population was the manifestation of the creation of elite in this second phase of economic development. But in each of the two phases, first of all, expropriation of mineral resources to send back to Europe. Secondly, agricultural production to supply raw materials to Europe. In each case, there's an institutional arrangement which is creating an elite. First of all, in the first phase, the encomienda system, and then subsequently the distribution of land ownership in a way that distributes it to relatively unequally to a relatively small group in the population. If we fast forward to today, we can see that that type of inequality in institutions that existed in the colonial era is manifested today in Latin America having relatively low rating for its institutional quality. So these data come from the Fraser Institute Freedom House rankings for 2010. There's 141 countries that are ranked. In the Freedom House rankings, there are rankings based on size of government, legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and regulation. And so I've included the ranking of the 8 economies that Madison classes as the major Latin American economies, and then I've included an average rating on each of these below. And you can see that 141 countries, so average is going to be 70, that pretty much for all of these categories, Latin America, or at least these 8 Latin American countries, rank well below average in, for example, equality of legal system and property rights. So on average, these countries rate 87th out of the 141. Sound money, 86th. Freedom to trade internationally, 75th, so just slightly below average. Amount of regulatory burden in the country, well below average. Size of government, a little bit below average, but still nowhere near the highest ranking countries in the world. So this gives some perspective on Sebastian Edwards' point regarding the association between poor quality institutions and economic development. That the history of Latin America is a history of creating elitist institutions, and if we look at institutions in Latin America today, we see that on a world scale, they're on average rated as having relatively low quality of institutions. So we've gone from a situation of having these elite institutions to institutions that would be regarded as low quality. So what I want to do now is talk about how we might tie together that history of the creation of institutions to the relatively poor quality of institutions that we see today. The first way that we can do that is using exactly the same approach to thinking about the emergence and persistence of colonial institutions that we looked at in the last lecture on Africa, the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson framework. So remember, the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson story is that different parts of the world end up with different institutions because of the approach that the colonisers took in those different regions of the world. More specifically, they argue that the disease environment in different regions of the world and the density of indigenous population in different regions of the world meant that in some parts of the world you had what they call expropriative institutions set up, institutions that basically involve the creation of an elite group from the colonising country who would enslave or force the local population to work for them. Or there was the settler colonies where because of the favourable disease environment, because there was low density of indigenous population, that colonisation would occur by bringing a large European population of European immigrants to the country. And there you get institutions which are like the European or Western institutions being established. So two types of regions, regions where you've got expropriative institutions and regions where you've got settler institutions. They then have different arguments for why we might expect those institutions to persist across time, and the final step in their argument is to show that there does seem to be a relationship between the types of institutions that were established historically and the types of institutions that exist today. For example, expropriative colonies that had expropriative institutions set up having lower security of property rights today, or having less satisfactory arrangements for undertaking market transactions, whereas countries that had settler institutions set up having higher security of property rights and having better arrangements for undertaking market type transactions. So the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson story provides one way of tying the historical experience of the creation of institutions in Latin America through to the quality of institutions and economic performance today. The idea that features such as the encomienda system essentially represent the establishment of expropriative institutions. And so when you put that type of institutional structure together with the explanation for why institutions persist over time, you end up with poor quality of institutions today and lower levels of economic development today. As well as the type of cross-country or overall perspective that we talked about for the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson explanation of economic development in the last lecture. There are also more micro studies which try to address the issue of the historical origins of institutions and the long-term effect they might have had on economic development. One example would be Melissa Dell's work on the meter system of forced labour, working in the Potosi Silver and Huancavelica mercury mines in the 16th to the 19th century. So this was essentially a system where the Spanish required groups of the native population to work as a source of forced labour in the silver and mercury mines. Basically 1/7 of the population in designated villages was forced to work over this period in the silver and mercury mines. And what Dell shows is that the basis on which regions or villages were chosen to supply labour was essentially geographic, essentially random with respect to the level of economic development at the time. But if you look at institutional quality today, if you look at measures of economic development today between regions from which labour was taken to work under this forced labour system and regions where labour wasn't taken from, you see a much lower level of provision of public infrastructure such as roads. You see much lower levels of market development, and you see lower levels of economic development generally in the regions where the labour was taken from compared to neighbouring regions where labour wasn't taken from. So the explanation for this is the idea that in the regions where there was forced labour being taken, that's adversely affected, or it's set up institutions which have then carried through to the present and had an adverse effect on economic development. There's a second perspective on the development of institutions which has been particularly important in thinking about Latin American experience, which I also want to talk about, which is the Engelman and Sokolov approach to thinking about institutions. Engelman and Sokolov's idea is that there are differences between different regions that were colonised in geography, such as soils and climate, and in the size and density of the indigenous population. Those differences in geography and differences in the density of the indigenous population cause differences in method of production of what I've called here the staple, which is the main product which is being produced in these regions or countries for export to the rest of the world. The method of production of the staple, Engelmann and Sokoloff then argue, affects the distribution of wealth in a country. So, for example, they say, look, one area that was colonised was Canada. And we know in Canada the soils and climate and the relative low density of the indigenous population meant that you ended up with a major staple product being wheat, and the method of production of wheat was by small-scale farming by European immigrant population. So that's one example of this link from geography to method of production. And because that you had a large number of small-scale farmers supplying wheat from Canada, you end up with a relatively equal distribution of income, relatively equal distribution of wealth from the land ownership patterns that were established through having small-scale farming as the main agricultural activity. You then compare that with the Caribbean. So the Caribbean has soils and climate suitable for growing sugar, and in the Caribbean, while there wasn't large indigenous population, the slave population could be brought to the Caribbean. And so what that meant is that you end up with plantation-style agriculture being adopted as the method of growing sugar in the Caribbean. That means you end up with a much less even distribution of wealth, because you've got the slave population and you've got the elite group who are owning the plantations, who are getting all the returns from the production of sugar. So Engelmann and Sokolov are saying that geography determines the type of, in this case, agricultural product, but more generally the type of staple that a country can produce, and determines what will be the method of production of that staple. And the method of production of the staple then determines the distribution of wealth in that particular country or region. The next step in Engelmann and Sokolov's argument is to say that the distribution of wealth in a country is going to determine the distribution of political power in the country, and in particular the extent of franchise, the proportion of the population who can vote. So if we take the example of Canada, where we've said that there was a relatively even distribution of wealth and income, then the idea is that that's going to translate into a relatively even distribution of political power, or there's going to be a relatively large proportion of the population who are allowed to vote. What follows from that is that politicians, in choosing policies, if there's a relatively large proportion of the population who can vote, are going to have to choose policies that reflect the preferences of that relatively large proportion of the population. So they're going to be more likely, where there's a broad franchise, to worry about introducing, for example, public education systems of education that are going to provide education to a broad group in the population. Or they're going to be worried about policies for distributing land that benefit a broad group in the population. Whereas if we think about a situation where the distribution of wealth and hence the distribution of political power is more restricted, so for example there's only a small group, a small percentage in a country who are allowed to vote, then we would think that politicians are going to have less incentive, because there's going to be less pressure on them from the group in society who are voting, to do things like implementing public education systems that benefit the population generally, or adopt land policies that benefit the population generally also. And the final step in the argument is to say that the degree of equity in government policies is likely to feed through to differences in levels of income or rates of growth in income between countries. So, for example, the idea that a country with a broadly based public education system is going to be able to most develop the human capital of its population, and that will be something that promotes economic growth in the country. Engelmann and Sokolov have a taxonomy of countries between countries which began as colonies specialising in production of sugar and other high-value crops, which they identify as regions such as the Caribbean, where there was extensive use of slaves. They have a second type of country, which they identify as countries where, during colonial phase, had factory endowments characterised by rich mineral resources and substantial number of natives who could be put to work in large-scale mining. So an example would be Spanish America, the Potosi mines, which we've talked about. The third type of colony which they talk about, where they're not thinking of Latin America, is colonies that weren't endowed with large native populations or a geography conducive to large-scale production using slaves, for example, northern North America or Canada. So they're essentially saying that based on geography, there are some regions which became major producers of plantation-style crops. There were other countries which became producers using often forced labour or using tenant farm labour in the case of agricultural activity. And there was a third type of colony where you didn't have large-scale production using slaves or forced labour. In the first two cases, you get an elitist political system being established where there's a relatively restricted political power to a small oligarchic group in society. In the third case, you get political power being distributed more evenly. So, in other words, Engelman and Sokolov are drawing a distinction between northern North America and Canada and, for example, South America, saying, look, geography was such in Northern America that you got methods of production adopted which led to even distribution of wealth and hence an even distribution of political power, which has been the basis for successful economic development. In South America, for example, or Latin America, you had geography and the density of indigenous population, meaning that you ended up with institutions for production that were elitist or oligarchic, and you ended up with an uneven distribution of wealth, you ended up with an uneven distribution of political power, and that then acts as a brake on economic development. You can probably see a lot of similarities between the Engelman and Sokolov and the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson approaches to thinking about the development of institutions, and both of them are based around the idea of the development of elite groups in society, or the development of institutions that fail to represent society, the interests of society broadly. The big difference is that Engelman and Sokolov are really arguing that derives from geography, which causes differences in or the geography of production, which causes differences in the distribution of wealth. Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson are arguing that it really derives from the approach that the colonisers took when they came to particular regions or countries. There's a variety of evidence that's consistent with the Engelman-Sokolov approach. For example, we do know in Latin America that there's large inequalities in the distribution of land. So in the middle of the 19th century, where 60% of North American farmers owned the land that they farmed on, in Latin America only 5% of the agricultural workforce owned the land that they were farming. We also know, as this graph shows, that the proportion of the population who were able to vote in the late 19th, early 20th century in Latin America is relatively low. That's the purple line, compared to, say, Canada or the United States. And it does seem that difference in franchise has translated into the type of education system in the two different regions, at least in terms of measured outcomes from literacy rates. That in Canada and the United States you had much higher literacy rates at that time, 80 to 90%, than you got in any of the Latin American countries. There's also some evidence against the Engelman-Sokolov argument. So, for example, the idea of is geography fate? So Engelman and Sokolov really argue that once you know the geography, once you know the main staple activity, whether it's mining or whether it's growing crops, temperate climate crops, or raising livestock, that will determine the type of institutional arrangements for production. But we know that there are regions of the world which were also rich in mineral resources, such as regions like Peru in Latin America, or there are regions in the world where the major staple activity was growing crops, temperate climate crops, or raising livestock, as in, say, Argentina, where you ended up with much less elitist institutions. So one question is about whether there is always as strong a link from the geography to the method of production, in particular the degree of elitist control of production, as Engelman and Sokolov would suggest. There's also some analysis that suggests that historical inequality in outcomes like land ownership may not be able to explain the sort of cross-country income differences that we observe today. That isn't to say that inequality hasn't been an important long-term influence on economic development in Latin America. It's generally seen as a major underpinning influence on economic development. So, for example, the idea that there are effects of that having a less equal distribution of land ownership by creating a system whereby you have large landowners having their land farmed primarily by tenant farmers, that has resulted in lower productivity in agriculture in Latin America than in other regions of the world where a much larger proportion of the agricultural activity is being undertaken by landowners. Or the idea that an unequal distribution of income has acted as a barrier to creating enough demand in local markets to generate successful manufacturing or successful industrialization in Latin America. Or the idea that inequality in educational outcomes by meaning that a large proportion of the population has relatively low levels of human capital, that's acted as a brake on industrialization in Latin America. So the general theme of this first part of this section of the lecture has been to say that a major theme in the economic development of Latin America has been inequality that's been manifested in the political institutions, inequality that's manifested in outcomes such as educational attainment, land ownership, the distribution of income, that we can see the institutional roots of that inequality in the colonial era, when we had the encomienda system, where we had the establishment of large agricultural estates, and that there are various theories, the Acemoglu-Johnson-Robinson theory, the Engelman-Sokolov theory, for how colonisation, how the commencement of production of staple products has been associated with those institutions.